Welcome to Trees Atlanta's Virtual Pruning 101 webinar. I'm Susan Pierce Cunningham, the Associate Director of Volunteer Services at Trees Atlanta. I'm also an ISA certified arborist and one of Trees Atlanta's pruning instructors. If you have any questions after viewing this webinar, please reach out to me via email. My contact information will be on the last slide, and you can also find it on Trees Atlanta's website. So this is the second step in becoming a certified tree pruner with Trees Atlanta. Your first step was watching the prerequisite videos by Dr. Ed Gilman on the University of Florida's Department of Environmental Horticulture site. We'll be reviewing information from his modules during this webinar, and we'll also discuss some common scenarios that you'll encounter when pruning with Trees Atlanta. The next step in becoming a certified tree pruner is to take our 5-question quiz. The link to the quiz was emailed to you along with the link to this webinar, or it will be emailed to you upon completion of this webinar. You must answer all 5 questions correctly to qualify for Pruning 101 complete status. You can retake the quiz if needed. Step 4 is then taking the Pruning 102 class in person. You can register for this class only after completing Pruning 101. Once you have completed Pruning 102, we'll notify you of training completion and add the tree pruner certification to your contact record. So then you'll be able to register for Pruning 103 as well as any of our pruning volunteer opportunities on our web calendar. Our mission at Trees Atlanta is to protect and improve our urban forest by planting, conserving, and educating. Volunteers like you are an integral part of this mission. They take part in all 3 aspects through individual and group opportunities. To learn more about our programming or to register to volunteer, please visit treesatlanta.org. Virtual Pruning 101 is a newer class, and we want your feedback on how to improve your experience and your learning. You'll receive feedback requests after completing your quiz, so please share with us your ideas to make this an even better experience. Today we'll talk about why we prune trees and why we need your help. We'll talk more about pruning for structure. I'll review and build on Dr. Gilman's classes and give you additional information for making pruning decisions. We'll also cover exactly how we want you to make your pruning cuts and which tools are best for the job. So why do we prune? Healthy structure maximizes a tree's lifespan and its shade production. Clearance keeps branches out of the way of people, so cars, pedestrians, cyclists. Pruning off damage helps reduce or prevent the spread of decay in trees. And risk management is needed more later in a tree's life. Since we mostly focus on young tree training, we don't perform a lot of risk management pruning. Most of the risk management we need to do is because the tree wasn't pruned for good structure early in its life. Aesthetics is at the bottom of the list because I honestly think that pruning for good structure leads to good aesthetics. But sometimes people prune with aesthetics in mind first. So take these lace bark elms at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, for example. These elms are pruned into a box shape because it looks cool and it makes a great feature in this plaza. We have lots of trees that need pruning, and it's hard for us to keep up with just a small group of people who can prune. We can't invite any and all volunteers to prune with us because it is a specialized skill and it requires training. It takes practice to learn how to best help a tree grow. We're grateful for you for taking this Pruning 101 class, and we really appreciate you taking the time to learn to prune. We need your help. Trees Atlanta follows the American National Standards Institute's industry standards for pruning, which is included in the standard A300. A300 also includes information about lots of woody plant management topics. If you're interested in reading the standards, you can order a copy of the A300 Part 1 from either the International Society of Arboriculture or the Tree Care Industry Association. There's also an accompanying best management practices book that goes more in depth about the standards and how to apply them. Generally, trees grow towards the sun. In a more dense forest setting, this means trees grow upward toward the sky, or they grow slowly in the shady understory where light is not as plentiful. When we plant trees in full sunlight, they grow differently, and not always the way that we would prefer. Pruning helps us humans achieve our goals for these trees, despite the unnatural conditions that the trees are not necessarily designed for. So at Trees Atlanta, we try to prune upon planting, and again between 3 and 5 years old. Some trees need follow-up pruning at 10 years of age, but some trees are just too large for us at 10 years of age to prune with volunteers. We are not getting to all of our trees on the schedule currently, and as I mentioned before, we really need your help so that we can get attention to all of our trees. I consider young tree training pruning to be the pruning that happens between ages 1 and 15 years. It just depends on the species of tree. Establishing the strong structure early in a tree's life goes a long way to preventing future problems. Also, smaller wounds are easier for a tree to close off, especially when a tree is growing vigorously when it's young. So the two main points for you to take away from this class is that we need to maintain central leaders on overstory trees that we want to grow tall. And we need to maintain low aspect branch ratios on all of our trees to promote strong branch attachments. A few circumstances that I want to note are park and open lawn trees. It's important to leave lower branches on for longer than we do with street trees to protect the main stem from lawnmower and weed eater damage. With crepe myrtles, very little pruning is needed for structure. We're mostly pruning for clearance and damage. And with dogwoods, if it's planted as a street tree, it's already prone to higher stress. So we recommend lighter pruning with each dose and a focus on damaged wood and clearance issues. As Dr. Gilman explained, decurrent trees lose their central leader eventually. With plentiful sunshine available, they'll lose it very quickly. Most trees we plant have decurrent growth habit. I could only think of a couple of examples of excurrent trees we plant, and that was bald cypress and Dawn redwood. So these trees are a little bit easier to prune for central leader structure because they have such a strong central leader with lots of small aspect ratio primary branches coming off of that leader. We also plant quite a few species that are naturally multi-stemmed. Some of those include sweet bay magnolia, serviceberry, crepe myrtle, American fringe tree, Perodia, deciduous magnolias, river birch. There's quite a few. When planted in a narrow area, we prune to keep the number of stems at a reasonable size on these multi-stem trees. So the crepe myrtle in this picture has 7 to 8 stems, which works for this large 8-foot wide landscape strip in West End. But the tree is putting out more sprouts, which might equal more stems. So this volunteer, the lovely Sarah Bowles, is pruning off the new growth in effort to keep the stems at that 7 to 8 number. If the landscape strip here were smaller, we might need to help this crepe myrtle have just 3 or 4 stems to provide adequate clearance for the street and the sidewalk. So we would want to reduce the number of stems early in that tree's life. The earlier you can get it down to a lower number of stems, the more effective it is. If we wait or if this tree gets stressed, sometimes pruning off the sprouts and extra stems becomes a yearly task, especially with trees that just really want to be multi-stemmed like crepe myrtles. So the central leader contains the apical meristem, which means the highest meristem on the tree, or in other words, the highest point of growth on a tree. If good aspect ratios are maintained in the primary and lateral branches, and there aren't many competing leaders, this apical meristem has the most direct signal pathway down to the roots of the tree, which means that it is going to grow the most. At the apical meristem is the apical bud. It contains the cells for next year's branch expansion, and it's a key part of this tree that we want to maintain. We don't want to accidentally remove that apical bud. So here's an example of a sweet gum that doesn't have a great central leader. From a distance, you can see that there are 4 to 6 stems, all culminating at about the same height. Delineated, I drew a yellow line here for y'all to see about that height. A full walk around this tree might reveal which stems are taller, which stems are straighter, and which are bigger in diameter. All 3 of these factors play into our decision-making process for choosing a good central leader. I like Dr. Gilman's summary, where he said, suppress, reduce, subordinate large aspect ratio stems to create and maintain a leader. So identifying that central leader, which one you think will be the best, is only the first step. We also need to address any of those primary branches that are coming off of the main trunk that may have high aspect ratios. An aspect ratio of 80% and higher is a weak branch attachment. You often won't even see that branch protection zone in the branches or in the attachments that are higher, that have aspect ratios higher than 80%. We want to keep our aspect ratios closer to around 30%. The branch here pictured is about 30% aspect ratio, which means that this branch is about 30% the size of the branch it's coming off of. In this case, it looks like the trunk, the main stem. Here's an example of a branch with a high aspect ratio. This branch on the right is about 90% the size of the branch on the left. This is a split here that I would call codominant stems. We don't have a branch collar visible here because there is not a strong branch protection zone in this area. So if this were on a tree or a pruning, I would want to address this high aspect ratio by somehow reducing the growth in one of these stems, likely the stem on the right that has that is about 90% the size of the stem on the left. We'll actually revisit this example later on. Here's an example of an eastern redbud planted in a park. So it's this nice open lawn setting. We don't have to worry about clearance for a street or a sidewalk here. As you can see, the redbud is growing pretty wide. These lateral branches are putting on a lot of growth, getting really wide. If this were planted in between the street and the sidewalk, this tree would likely be a clearance issue for pedestrians or for cars that are trying to park along the street. And we would need to address this issue pretty quickly, hopefully early in this tree's life. I took a photo closer in this tree so that you can see some of the primary branches coming off of the trunk. A couple of those in this photo have really high aspect ratios, about 70%. So if I were pruning this tree, I would want to address those high aspect ratio branches first and make sure that I'm somehow reducing growth in those branches. So I'll be pruning those branches to remove some of the buds on them so that less energy is put into those branches in the future and more energy is put into the main stem or other branches. The branches that have a 40%, roughly 40% aspect ratio, I think I would also want to address during this pruning dose to try to reduce growth a little bit. And then the branches that have that 30% aspect ratio, I'm not as concerned about this time. It's a good spot to be, and hopefully that will continue. It's good to evaluate the whole tree and get a feel for where you think the energy is being put into it right now. Because this tree is getting plentiful sunshine, It's just growing outwards, and it doesn't have as much need to grow tall to reach that sunshine. We do prune a lot of our park trees as well as street trees. And so you'll encounter some trees like this where it's not necessarily an urgent issue to address those huge lateral branches. But we've seen with a lot of our red buds that if we don't maintain good aspect ratios, meaning low, around 30%, then we end up with weak branch attachments and a lot of failure in those branches. And we've had to go back and prune off a lot of broken or damaged branches on red buds because they had such high aspect ratios that they didn't have strong branch attachments. Here's an example of a black gum tree planted in Midtown. The photo on the left was taken about 10 years after the tree was planted. And I don't think this tree received the type of pruning that it needed to be really successful. So if we had pruned this tree upon planting for a central leader, it would most likely have a central leader growing up here in this area. Black gums are notorious for losing their central leaders easily. We need to be really careful when we plant them to prune them for a good, strong central leader, or we'll end up with a stunted tree like this. This photo on the right here shows what it looks like inside the tree. There are quite a few branches with high aspect ratios, like here, this one that's crossing over the main trunk. Up here, we have quite a few high aspect ratios, really no good central leader. If this black gum had a good, strong central leader, it could be 80, 90 feet in maturity. But as it stands now, this tree might only reach like 30 or 40 feet in maturity. We want to maximize the growth of our trees, so we want to make sure that they are keeping that strong central leader. If I were to prune this tree, it would probably take a while to address a lot of these high aspect ratios, and I would want to come back for several years to make sure that we don't have to remove too much of the tree's live crown at once. One more thing I wanted to mention to you is that we are pruning these primary branches right now to support growth in a tree, and that they're not permanent. So this is a white oak in my front yard. When this tree is 50 plus years old, I'd like for the lowest branch to be at least 15 feet up. Currently, the tree is about 15 feet tall, which means that all of the branches currently on the tree are not permanent. They are there to support this tree's growth currently and help it get tall. When trees are in a more natural forested area, they shade their branches out and self-prune by cutting off resources to branches that are no longer producing many sugars. But in urban settings, we often have to prune out these shaded branches or dead limbs to provide clearance. And some people like to prune them off for aesthetic reasons as well. So another example on the right here is a red maple in my front yard. It has this high aspect ratio branch at about 6 feet up the trunk. I imagine this tree was probably at least 6 feet tall when it was planted. It was planted almost 20 years ago. So this branch that is now high aspect ratio was likely on that tree when it was planted. If this tree had been pruned to reduce that high aspect ratio as it grew over its first few years, we wouldn't have that issue now. When we moved into the house a few years ago, I started to prune this tree to address that high aspect ratio. So I hired an arboriculture company to come in and reduce growth. They did a reduction cut up here in the tree, and I hope to see the growth in this branch slow down so that this side of the tree will grow more, and this will continue to be more of our central leader in this maple. And also, I hope to promote a stronger branch attachment eventually by having a lower aspect ratio in this branch. So I'm addressing the issue now, but it's going to take a lot longer to resolve now that the tree is older. and growing a bit more slowly. So how much do we remove when we're pruning? At each pruning dose, which means each visit that we do to a tree to prune it, the tree can typically handle about 30% of its live crown removal. I don't recommend pruning a tree more than once a year, so that you're allowing time for the tree to recover from the pruning that you do. Now, some of our more tough species can handle more than 30%, and some of our more delicate species need less than 30%. You'll get to know these species as you prune with us. We typically plant pretty tough species as street trees. Some of the more tougher ones that I'm comfortable going up to 50% are American elm, Perodia, trident maple, and American hornbeam. There are others, but those are really common ones that Trees Atlanta plants. If you see a serious issue with the central leader in any of these tougher species, then I recommend you address those issues now, even if it means that you'll be removing up to 50% of its live crown. It's better to take care of the issue now while the tree is young, and rather than wait till it's older, because then it's going to take longer to resolve the issues that you see, and you may have to remove even more of its live crown ratio if you wait until the tree's bigger. Some of the more delicate understory trees, like I mentioned before, we want to be careful to just prioritize clearance issues and really bad structural issues so that we don't exceed more than 20% of live crown removal. Remember that anything that's dead or damaged doesn't count towards that percentage of live crown removal. A few examples of the more delicate species that we recommend not exceeding 20% are pawpaw, serviceberry, silver bells, Florida maple, dogwoods. But we don't plant as many of those as street trees. So real quick review on the types of pruning cuts that we make. A removal cut is the cutting of a subordinate branch back to a more dominant branch or the trunk. Reduction is cutting a dominant branch back to a subordinate branch. And then a heading cut is cutting back to a node that doesn't necessarily have a branch, but you're cutting back to a bud. And the heading cuts usually happen, or we're doing them more on our younger trees because they just haven't put on as many branches yet. So making proper cuts is very important. On the left is an example of a good pruning cut. So it's a lacebark elm, and this photo was taken 1 year after the branch was pruned off. The wound is closing now. You can see that it's forming wound wood around that pruning cut. And it looks good because the wound wood is growing pretty evenly all around that branch. The branch that was removed was circular in shape, and the wound is circular as well. So this is what we want to see happening with your pruning cuts. The pruning cut, or excuse me, the photo on the right here is a wound that has completely closed up. And eventually this tree might grow more wood over that wound, so you won't even be able to see it anymore. Well, that was what a good cut looked like. Now let's talk about some bad cuts. So the cut on the left here is a flush cut, which means that when this branch was removed, somebody cut into the branch protection zone. Some of the branch collar was removed, and now the wound is closing unevenly. So you've got more wound wood growing here on the sides, less wound wood growing on the top and bottom, and that cut was wider than it needed to be. It's going to take longer for this tree to close up this wound, which means that it leaves it more susceptible to pathogens entering the tree and causing decay for longer. Another type of larger wound that we often or sometimes make as a mistake is from stripping bark. So here on the right is an example of an American elm where the bark stripped all the way down this branch. I don't know that this was necessarily from pruning damage. It could have been from the branch being stripped off by being hit by a car, or maybe a person pulled it off. but it does happen when we're pruning sometimes. American elms have pretty thin bark and they're prone to stripping. I've accidentally stripped bark off of an American elm several times while using a pole pruner because I wasn't able to get a good clean cut. We want to try to avoid that because if we strip the bark, again, it makes a larger wound than necessary. It takes the tree longer to close up the wound and it leaves the tree more susceptible to decay. On this specific example, I would likely just end up doing a complete removal cut of this branch. American elms are pretty tough, and I think it would recover okay from that. If you strip the bark on the central leader, that is way worse because you don't want to prune your central leader off. So be really careful when pruning branches off of that central leader on an American elm. Another example of an improper cut is leaving too much of the branch behind. We call this a stub cut. It's more wood for the tree to have to close up or cover with wound wood, and since it takes longer to close up these stubs, again, it's leaving the tree more susceptible to decay for longer. So let's talk about the parts of the tree that we need to consider when we're pruning. On young branches that don't necessarily have lateral branches, you might be making heading cuts. On those branches, we need to note where the buds are because that shows us where the node is. A node is simply anywhere that there's a bud. And then the space in between the nodes is called the internode. On the right here, we have a tree with a substantial branch coming off. If we were going to make a removal cut and remove this branch, we'd want to note where the branch collar is. So in this branch protection zone, we've got the external signs are the branch bark ridge and our branch collar. If we were in person with this tree, we'd likely be able to feel that branch collar because it's going to be raised, almost like swollen feeling around that branch. That branch collar is helping cover the attachment of this branch to its dominant branch or trunk. And so it means that we have a good, strong branch protection zone here. And just to repeat for you guys, this is because we have a lower aspect ratio that we have this strong branch attachment zone. So here's our branch collar. I can tell from the photo about where it is because there's a change in the bark texture. So here we have these vertical creases on the bark. And over here, we have more horizontal creases on our bark. And that change occurs right about here. So this is right about the edge of our branch collar. We're going to revisit this photo in a second. But first, let's talk about where we're going to make cuts on this smaller branch if we were making heading cuts. We want to remove as much of this internode as possible without removing the node that we want to leave behind. So if we wanted to prune back to this node, we'd make this cut just above the node while pruning off as much of the internode as possible. Same goes down here. If we were pruning back to this node, we want to make our cut just above it and leave that bud intact. Now, revisiting that branch, where would we make our cut here if we were going to do a removal back to this main stem? We want to be just outside our branch collar, right about here. So we're leaving that branch collar intact, but removing as much of the branch as possible. Let's do one more example. So right where this person is pointing is marking the change between the branch collar and the branch. Again, I can see kind of vertical creases on that branch collar and horizontal creases on the branch. That transition looks like it happens right about here. So if we were to do a removal cut, removing this smaller branch, we would want to cut just outside that branch collar, leaving it intact. By leaving the branch collar intact, we leave behind specialized cells that will help that tree close up the wound more quickly. And Dr. Gilman shows in some of his videos that sometimes on larger branches, that branch collar can be pretty far out. And you might think that it looks like you're leaving behind a stub, but really you're appropriately leaving behind the branch collar. I encourage you to watch more of his videos. He gives lots of great examples where he shows the branch collar and where to remove the branch. Sometimes when removing a branch, the weight of that branch can cause the bark to strip off. So to prevent this from happening, we use the 3-cut method. The 3-cut method means that we're starting our cut outside or at a slight distance away from the branch collar to avoid stripping any bark into that branch collar. So first you make your undercut, and then you make a second cut just slightly outside that undercut, and the branch should snap cleanly off. After you remove the weight of that branch, then you do your final cut just outside the branch collar. Here's an example that I did recently. I want to remove this branch because it was damaged farther out. And so I'll show you my 3-cut method. First, I did my undercut out here. Then I did my overcut, and you can see it's starting to crack. It did remove cleanly. Sorry, the photo's blurry. This is what it looked like afterward. And then I was able to go back and do my final cut just outside of the branch collar. Because I removed the weight of that branch already, I didn't have any problems with the bark stripping. Looks pretty good. The branch I removed was circular in shape, and so is the wound, which makes me feel good. I know that I've made the smallest wound possible here, and I've left the branch collar intact. But sometimes I make mistakes. Often I make mistakes. So here I was doing a reduction cut on that same tree, and I realized about halfway through removing this branch that I was not at the right angle. So I started my cut in towards that branch bark ridge. Too much so. I should have angled it more like this, where I've drawn this yellow line, and I would have avoided that branch bark ridge with a nice smooth cut. So what I had to do to mitigate this problem was about halfway through, I stopped cutting from this direction and I came in from the other direction. But right here, you can see I ended up with a wound that was not flat. I still think the tree will be able to close up this wound fairly decently. It might take it slightly longer though. So not ideal, but not horrible. Here's another mistake I made. When we were filming our virtual pruning webinar back in May, I pruned my crepe myrtle in the front, and I got a little too close on the bottom. I accidentally removed some of that branch collar on the bottom, and I even stripped a little bit of the bark down here. So I took this photo about 8 months after I made the cut, and you can see that wound wood is starting to form here, but not so much down here, where I removed part of that branch collar and bark. So it's going to take the tree slightly longer to close up this wound. And this is what we want to try to avoid. This is why we're careful to make sure that we start our cuts from the bottom of the branch and cut up so that we don't accidentally strip a little bit of that bark. Let's talk about tools. We recommend wearing safety goggles and gloves while you prune. If you're pruning above your head, sometimes the sawdust from the branches can get in your eye. So safety goggles or good sunglasses that cover your eyes work really well. And then wearing gloves is important to prevent you from cutting your hands accidentally. It's also important to stay aware of where your hands are while you're making cuts so that you don't accidentally cut your hand that's holding a branch right below you. We use folding saws because they're easy to carry around. If you use a saw that doesn't fold, you'll want a sheath for it to protect yourself so that you don't accidentally cut yourself while carrying your saw around. I recommend purchasing a saw that you can find replacement blades for easily. Saw blades are hard to sharpen. It's hard to get a file into all of those little teeth. So having the ability to replace your blade as needed is key with pruning. So maybe a common brand that you know already has replacement blades. Just do a little bit of research before you purchase your own folding saw. We also recommend using bypass hand pruners. So there's two types of hand pruners I've seen out there, and one is an anvil style where the blades kind of hit up against each other like this, but we recommend using bypass blades that pass each other like this. You'll get a cleaner cut and you will avoid smushing the branch that you're leaving behind. We also use pole pruners as needed when we can't reach the branches from a stepladder or from the ground. The pole pruners are great. I really love them. One thing I want to note though is that they have a much larger mechanism up at the top. And when pruning with these, you have to fit this mechanism in between the branches that you're pruning. So sometimes it makes it harder for you to get a closer cut. And I found that I often leave just a little bit of a stub when I'm using the pole pruner, especially on some tight branch attachments. So whenever possible, I use my hand pruners and a step ladder, but that pole pruner is key for getting to some of our trees that are fast growing or are maybe a little bit older. We also use pole saws sometimes. I don't even think that I'm very experienced with them. I've been pruning for a while, but I'm just not very good with a pole saw. I found that the saw blade tends to jump around on the branch because I don't have great control from a distance. But if you're able to practice and get good at it, it can be a really useful tool for some of our larger trees. And then we also use step ladders when we're pruning. We don't use very tall step ladders because we want you to stay safe. When you're using a step ladder, make sure you have a partner there to hold your step ladder steady while you're on it. And we also recommend following the rules of ladders. And if it says don't step on the top, don't step on the top. Only go up to the highest stair that it recommends. So Trees Atlanta brings out tools to our pruning projects. So you don't have to have your own tools. You can borrow from Trees Atlanta. But a lot of our advanced pruners really like having their own tools, and they found certain brands that they really enjoy using. So if you're able to come out to projects, you'll be able to chat a little bit more with some of the experienced pruners and get tips on what types of equipment they like. All right, we're going to do one example together. This is a Shumarda oak that's planted in a park. So it's growing in a very open area. I took this photo last summer and then I revisited it this winter and did some pruning. So this Shumarda oak doesn't have a great central leader. It has 4 codominant stems that are all right about here, all ending in the same area. So I know that the main thing I need to address when pruning this tree is pruning for a central leader. This oak is an overstory species. I want it to get big and tall, and the only way it'll be able to do that is by having that central leader. So the purple arrow is what I ultimately chose as my central leader, and the red arrows are the other 3 areas that I'm going to have to reduce. So, or subordinate, excuse me. Like Dr. Gilman said, there are 3 steps when pruning for central leader. So the first step is decide what will be your central leader. The second step is identify what's competing with your central leader. And then the third step is deciding where to make your pruning cuts to subordinate those competing leaders. Let me go back real quick. I'm going to show you photos in a second of what the tree looks like from different angles, but the way that I decided the central leader was by circling the tree, looking at it from all different angles, and deciding what the straightest and strongest looking branch option was. So now we're going to go through the tree, and I'll show you after I decided what my central leader is, where I made the pruning cuts as well. But first, let's go through and decide on the central leader together. So here's a shot from last summer of the tree about 5 feet up. Right here is where we have our first issue. This is a photo that I showed you earlier in the presentation with the high aspect ratio example. So 5 feet up in the tree, we have a split here where the branch on the right is about 90% the size of the branch on the left. I ultimately chose the branch on the left to be my central leader because it had more growth on that side of the tree. And that means that I know I need to subordinate or reduce growth on this right side of the tree. Just in case I just said that wrong, I'm choosing the left side of the tree, and I know I need to heavily reduce growth in the right side of the tree. All right, so I've chosen this left side. Next, right up here, maybe like 6 inches above that first split, we've got another split. I've got 3 codominant stems here. So now I know that I need to choose one of these 3 codominant stems to continue to be that central leader. I chose this one because it headed towards the sky, looked straighter to me. These 2 went off more to the side and looked more like lateral branches. So this is going to be my central leader here. And I know that I'm going to need to address these 2 to reduce the growth in them so that they're no longer competing with this one. All right, so here are those photos where I circled the tree. The purple arrow is our central leader in each photo, but you can see that the tree looks slightly different from every angle where I took a photo. As you're circling the tree, that central leader might look like it's heading more one direction than another, and it can be tricky to decide what should be your central leader. Sometimes there's really no perfect option, and you just have to go with your gut or just pick one. If they all look about the same, then you can just decide which one based on like maybe its size or maybe the number of lateral branches coming off of it. So here's my central leader again. Here are those competing leaders I know I need to address. Now I have to decide, where am I going to make my pruning cuts so that I can subordinate those competing leaders and encourage growth into the central leader. So I chose to do a reduction cut on this side of the tree. So remember, this is where we had that split where we've got the high aspect ratio branch coming off of our leader. And I know I need to reduce growth greatly in this side. So I'm going to do a reduction all the way back to this lateral branch here, greatly reducing the number of buds on that side of the tree in hopes that the tree will eventually put more energy into this side, and it will slowly correct this high aspect ratio because this side of the tree will grow more and this side of the tree will grow less. So then let's talk about the left side of the tree. Here's my central leader again. I've got these 3 branches here that all split from one spot. I decided to do a complete removal of one of them, the one that's here towards the front. So the yellow lines on this photo are reduction cuts, and the red lines are removal cuts that I made. So I'm completely removing this one, but then we still have this one over to the left. I decided to just reduce growth in this branch by making a reduction cut here. So there was a lot of growth going on up here, and I'm going to reduce the number of buds in this branch by cutting it back to another small lateral branch. This is the central leader I chose. And once we get higher up on it, it splits again and has what looks like a codominant stem here. So I chose to reduce growth there as well to encourage this to continue to be the central leader. So I didn't make that many cuts on this tree. Down here, this last removal cut was because there was damage on the branch, and that's the example that I showed you earlier. So here's what the tree looked like after I pruned it. I left the marks there so you can see where I made the cuts. So I've greatly reduced growth on the right and slightly reduced growth here in the left to encourage this branch to be the central leader. Sorry, there's a lot of background noise on this photo. I know it's hard to see, but the leader ends like right about here. Here's what the tree looked like after pruning from a couple different angles. And again, the purple arrow is where the central leader is. After taking these photos, I actually realized that there was a little bit more I wanted to do. And I think I made one more final cut up here just to reduce competition for that central leader. I removed like a tiny little lateral branch that I was worried about maybe competing in the next couple years. Here is the finished tree with the branches laying on the ground. During the summer or spring when we're pruning and there are leaves on the tree, leaving your branches on the ground can really help you estimate what percentage of the live crown you removed. So you'll do an estimate kind of in your head before you start pruning when you're making your plan. But then putting those branches next to the tree can help you review how much you've removed and really make sure that you're not going above either 20, 30, or 50%, just depending on that species. So I wanted to address just a couple common questions I usually get during these pruning webinars. So do we dress the wounds with anything? Meaning, do we use paint or some kind of cover on the wounds after we prune? And we do not put anything on our pruning wounds. It's generally not recommended by arborists. I have heard of cases where an arborist will put something on a wound, but it has to do with pests that are prevalent in the area and the time of year that the pruning is done. But you, Pruning for Trees Atlanta, will not put anything on the wounds. And then I also often get questions from people about what to do if they see utility pruning that they don't think is following the ANSI standards, or they're worried about it causing damage to the trees. So the most common utility pruning we see here in Atlanta is for power lines. They have to provide at least 10 feet of clearance around their power lines to make sure that there's no interference. And here in Georgia, Georgia Power is the main power utility. They hire contractors to do their pruning work. So if you're ever concerned about the work that those contractors are doing, I recommend reaching out to the utility. At Georgia Power, they have foresters assigned to different regions of the state, and you can reach out to them, ask questions. I've even met with them on site before. They're usually really great about getting their general contractor to meet with me as well. If you ever have trouble finding their contact information, feel free to reach out to me and I can help with that. So what's next? Come out to Pruning 102 with us. We offer our in-person pruning classes during the spring, summer, and winter. Usually we take a break in the fall to focus on tree planting and special events. So if you're viewing this webinar in the fall, just stay tuned and check our web calendar. The pruning classes will be posted soon, typically starting in February, and they go through September. At Pruning 102, you'll be able to get hands-on practice with the concepts that you've learned in Dr. Gilman's videos and in this webinar. And you'll have a pruning instructor there with you to help answer your questions and help you practice making decisions about what to prune on the trees. You'll practice on younger trees and maybe some of our most common species during Pruning 102. During Pruning 103, we will prune some of our more challenging species and some older trees to help build your confidence with making those tougher pruning decisions. Pruning 101 is required to take both Pruning 102 and 103, though you don't have to have completed Pruning 102 to take Pruning 103 necessarily. And then I really encourage you to come out and prune with us at volunteer projects. We can pair you up with an experienced pruner so that they can help you make decisions while you're still learning. And sometimes you'll even get to work with a pruning instructor at those volunteer projects. You can view our web calendar to see upcoming classes and volunteer opportunities. Our pruning volunteer opportunities are every Saturday, April through September, and then we occasionally have other pruning opportunities in the fall and winter. You can also prune by yourself. Once you've received your pruning certification and you feel ready, you can prune solo You can work with our Neighborwoods team to either prune in your own area, or we can recommend some areas that we haven't been able to get to that need more attention. So please reach out to me with your questions. Don't forget to take the quiz to complete your pruning certification. And I hope to see you at an in-person pruning class or volunteer project soon. Thank you very much for taking this webinar. We really appreciate your time, and don't forget, we really need your help. Take care.